two distinct groups of early South Asian Muslim migrants to the U.S. The earlier group consisted of men from the region of Hooghly, just north of Calcutta in West Bengal, who began coming to the U.S. in the 1880s to sell embroidered silks and cottons that were produced in their region. And they came to the beach boardwalks of New Jersey, like Atlantic City and Asbury Park, during the summertime, and then made their way to the U.S. South, particularly based in New Orleans, and basically created a network that stretched throughout the U.S. South and into the Caribbean and Central America, following the pathways of early travelers and tourists. And there was a small group of those men who ended up settling in New Orleans and marrying within the Creole and African American communities there and settling in the neighborhood of Treme. That was the earlier history, and then the second part of the book is about, again, primarily Bengali Muslim men who were working on British steamships, and they worked under really awful indenture-like conditions, and when they had an opportunity to, would sometimes jump ship in places like London and in Britain. But what I found was that they were also jumping ship in U.S. ports like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. So the second part of the book really traces out the networks that those sailors or maritime workers built, and then eventually a smaller community of those men who married within Puerto Rican and African American communities in Harlem and the New York area. There are two kind of beginning points, I would say. The first was just kind of something that I made note of when I heard of it, and this was back in the early 1990s. I heard from my wife's grandmother, who was a columnist for the New York Amsterdam News, the African American paper based in New York City, back in the 50s, and she told stories about how she and her friends, who were also journalists and local Harlem politicians and other folks, who used to have their special occasions catered from Indian restaurants that were in Harlem back in the 50s. And so when I heard that story long back in the early 90s, it just kind of piqued my interest. So, what were, it's the first time I had heard of Indian restaurants in Harlem, especially that early on. And then just a couple of years later, I met Alauddin Ullah, who grew up in Spanish Harlem and was of Bangladeshi descent. And at the time that we met, he was acting and doing stand-up comedy, and I was working on my documentary films, and he had seen one of my earlier films, which was about South Asian taxi drivers in New York, and he approached me and started telling me about his father and how he wanted to make a documentary about his father. And his father, Habib, his story was so unique and so different from anything I had heard. And it was essentially that Habib had come to New York from East Bengal in the 1920s and then settled in Harlem in the 1930s, married a Puerto Rican woman from the neighborhood, had two kids who were Aladdin's older half-siblings, and lived out his whole life essentially in Spanish Harlem. So I wanted to find out whether Alauddin's father was just one person who somehow managed to have this particular trajectory, or whether he was part of another history. And as it turned out, as I started looking into the archives, I found that he was in fact part of a much larger history of Indian Muslim maritime workers who were jumping ship and settling in primarily in black neighborhoods in U.S. cities. What stands out about these earlier groups is that that they followed a very different trajectory from what is kind of put forth as the iconic immigrant trajectory. So in that iconic immigrant story, new immigrants come to the U.S., they leave their past behind, they create new communities in enclaves like little Italies and little Indias, and then over time, supposedly, gain wealth and move out to the suburbs and kind of integrate into what's predominantly a white suburban world, right? And what was different about these early groups is that they came, first of all, at a time when U.S. immigration laws were tightening and were explicitly anti-Asian. So after 1917, there was an entire swath of Asia that was deemed the Asiatic barred zone, and immigrants from those regions just weren't even allowed in the country. So at a time when the U.S. nation has basically rejected this entire group of potential immigrants from Asia, it was black neighborhoods and communities that actually gave them the possibility to build lives in the U.S. And so their trajectories were not, they didn't form ethnic enclaves, but rather integrated into existing working class communities of color. And so it's a very different immigration story, and it's an immigration story in which the kinds of ties that these immigrants built with other communities, were on the basis of shared experiences of, whether it's colonization or white supremacy in the South, but also, the experience of not having full purchase on U.S. citizenship or full membership in the nation. One of the aspects of this project is actually a web-based oral history project, which is just in its beginnings at BengaliHarlem.com. But the goal of that project is just to create an ongoing project of historical recovery where the family members and descendants of these early histories will be able to tell their own stories either by writing or doing interviews and share family photographs, etc. So that project aims to be a kind of continuation or afterlife of the book and the film, so that we can continue to document these histories.